You have evaded the invincibles for now. You can hear them stomping behind you as you rush down the stairs. And at the bottom of the stairwell, you come out into a large underground cavern. This great lake spans before you with no apparent crossing. You need to find a way across to continue your search and exploration of the Doomvault, hoping to stop the Ogdru Brotherhood from completing their dark ritual in the time of the Essence. So we're now moving into the Mirror Lake, or the Lake of the Dead, depending on which supplement you're using to run your adventure. And we're going to be diving deep into this particular scene, which starts really opening up a lot of possibilities. The Hag's Roost and the Long Pattern encounters were fairly simple in that they had just a simple threat or simple enemy that they need to deal with. But now, as we dive really into the meat of the Doomvault, things are going to start getting a little bit more complex as these rooms get bigger, and we have more to contend with as things escalate. So we have our map of the Doomvault, and we find ourselves right here in the center of Mirror Lake. And we're going to be using, for now, the core adventure. Let's see if I'm going to... There we go. We'll stick with that for there. So our players have kind of gone down the stairwell, and we have the Invincibles coming down the way. For me, the very first thing is, with this particular scene, I'm going to leave the target at about a 12. Still, just a very basic average target number for the scene, just for the difficulty. If we look at the core, it says, Mirror Lake, and it's an underground lake with no apparent crossing. Beneath the still black water, the Brotherhood slide and slurp in their murky trances. Cave ropers are above and below what were once men swim about, and noxious vapors. That's the general gist of what we have available. So once I've established the target, I'm also going to drop in the Invincibles, and I'm going to just have a timer, for example, and that's going to be just a D4. So rolling a 1, I'll have this up here, and I'll let players know that in D4 rounds, in this case 1 round, the Invincibles are going to stomp their way down the stairs and enter the scene. I really, really like having the Invincibles as just a continuous back pressure moving through the rest of the Doomvault after the Long Pattern, and it just kind of spurs players onward, keeps them from sticking around. Now, as we look at this particular Mirror Lake scene, we have this no apparent crossing, and like the description says, we've got a couple threats to deal with, and those would be, cave ropers, which are these kind of sentient stalagmites or stalactites, and so you can pop them over wherever, and I'll get to them in just a second. As well as we have what were once men, these slurpy, half tentacled humanoids slurping around in the dark water. We have some noxious fumes as well that we'll get to. The treats, if we want to get into some treats, is I usually leave out some, the skeletons are there. We can always loot some bodies, and especially what I like to do in the Doomvault is having the Hag's Roost have a skeleton at the beginning. I can start cluing in my players that skeletons, as I leave around, especially if I start associating this particular index card over and over again, it can clue them in, to the fact that if I lay this card out, this is something that could offer some kind of really kind of basic loot, like shabby. So a skeleton equals shabby loot in the adventure, especially if these are new players, can kind of just be a helpful, subtle guide to encourage them to interact in more ways than just attack or run or whatever. Like, there's things to interact with in the game. So it's a way of teaching new players that there's the stuff that I leave out is interactable. And I do that with the skeletons here. So we got some skeletons treats, one on the close side and one on the far side, so that there's something to grab either way. Our threats are the what were once men and the cave ropers. And then the timer is our Invincibles in this case. So timers, Invincibles, threats, the cave ropers, and the what were once men's treats are the skeletons, and finding some way across. Now, if I look at the monster stat, pages for these guys, from the Doomvault, this is where I'm going to spend a lot more of my time, because this particular encounter is much more combat driven, or it could be combat driven because there's a lot more monsters. So let's take a look at the at what were once men real quick, and just give kind of. So I'm looking at this page. It's available there. I'll have just it up, right around here, so we can look at it together. So what were once men to start out with? These things are sliding around in the water. They have 2 hearts, and they have +2 to all of their rolls. So they're beefy in their health, but they're not as beefy in their stats. They have a couple different attacks. So they've got Lash, which is just lashing out with their web claws and dual weapon. So let's zoom in again on here, and we'll talk through kind of how this is. So our players are out here. This guy bursts from the water and lashes out, just does weapon damage, a d6. Now drown, okay, this is where things start getting complicated, and you start moving away from just a basic tank and spank situation, which is why it's good to include these other options. Drowns is the way they drag you below the water, disappear in the murk, taking weapon damage each round that you're below the water, or you can make and then you can make a con roll to hold your breath and negate the damage, or make a strength roll to break free. If you take drowning damage twice, gulp water and be stunned for 1 round. So let's say that this guy comes up, he grabs this guy, and they're going to get pulled into the water. Now, they just take weapon damage, and this is a situation where I would not have our what were once men roll against the defense of the enemy, of one of the players. This would just happen because the players have a save instead. So they can take weapon damage. So if you have a what were once men come out and grab a player, then they are dealing with weapon damage unless they make a con roll save to hold their breath and negate the damage. They just say, all right, you've been dragged under the water. You pull one of the players away. No roll, nothing. You just say, make a con roll to hold your breath, and you can negate the damage, or you can make a strength roll to try to break free. You give your players that option to choose one or the other. If they roll con, they stay under the water, but they take no damage. If they make a strength roll, they would still take damage, but they would break free, and now they would burst off to the surface and be good to go. And then they could use their move to swim to a rock, or they could swim back to shore, whatever's happening. If they take drowning damage twice, they fail their roll, their saving roll twice, then they're stunned for 1 round, and now they're stuck under the water, and essentially they can't do anything. So this is a free, essentially it would give free weapon damage to the what were once men that were kind of holding them under the water. I would not have multiple what were once men kind of around there and dealing a lot of damage. You can very quickly kill a character in that way. So it's really just one what were once men, dragging them down, giving them some saves there, and going from there. But I think the key for drown is just making sure that you're not rolling against a normal attack against the player's defense, just because you have the save there, and it can really kind of it can fall flat. You want this drown to be a tactical thing, because now this player suddenly gets pulled in, and the other players have to either help them, or they have to hope that this person breaks out. Additionally, I'd be very cautious of using the drown ability on more than 1 or 2 of the party, up to too many. If all 4 of these suddenly get pulled in, then you can up the tension that way, but it can be really kind of disheartening. So be careful with how many times you use the drown ability on the party, just to keep things open. You want that tension, but not to kind of overwhelm things, because we have the cave ropers coming in. The other things you have is the water spine. This is the other thing, and this can be a great thing to use because it's a ranged. They shoot out sharp projectiles of water that hit up to far, and magical damage is inflicted. So this is something that can be dealt with as more what were once men pop up. They can shoot their water spine. This would be just a roll against the player's defense, and if they take it, If you hit the player, it's magical damage, being a D10 in this case. So water spines are quite deadly, and so this can kind of keep players back, and players can start using some of the stalagmites as cover from these water spines. The other things to keep in mind for the What Were Once Men is you have thieves. Is if they critical against a player, you take a piece of loot randomly from the player's equipped list. Keep in mind, equipped list, and the loot is utterly absorbed into their gelatinous guts and utterly ruined. So if you roll a critical, like a D20, a nat 20 on an attack, then you just kind of roll. I like to roll like a D10 for the equipped, and then you just count down the number that you roll. And if you get to the bottom of the equipped list, you just go back up to the top and then kind of scroll back down, but just randomly destroy something, and it's gone. It's just gone. It's a really simple way to kind of clear out loot a little bit, but it's based only on a critical. So with the What Were Once Men rolling hot, you got them. Stalkers, what were once men, as you're planning out your tactics and how they're going to move around, they're going to stay underwater as long as possible to gain an advantage and try to push them towards the cave ropers, or try to get them in a position where they can maybe separate these out. What Were Once Men are not going to like swarm these guys as just a big group. They're kind of stalking, and so I would only have maybe up to 4 of these What Were Once Men, again depending on the party size, but they're all kind of just creepily moving around as you're moving through, trying to push them in directions. And then the final thing is that these were once men, which is important because with some effort you could potentially reach out to them and kind of break them out of their hypnotized, brainwashed, mutated state. And so if you spend 1 heart of charisma effort, you can give them pause, but then 2 hearts of charisma effort turns them completely, and then they kind of awaken from their state. I would not make any of these guys allies because they're like permanent companions or whatever. It would be like if you did do this thing and they were to awaken, their nightmares are racking them horribly, and they may give some kind of like clue in a moment of sanity, but then they're going to be racked with the horrors and perhaps like run away or dive below or do something, and eventually they'll probably be brainwashed again. But yeah, I wouldn't keep these around and turn them into a companion, just because it's just one extra complication, and you want to leave these guys and play into the insanity of the Ogdru Brotherhood rather than now be walking around with a What Was Once Men little buddy. So whatever. Now this is the first monster that we're dealing with. The other thing that we're dealing with are the cave ropers. Right, these guys are a little bit beefier. We'll switch over here for the image here. The cave ropers are like these stalactites and stalagmites. They've got a +4 to all their rolls and 2 hearts. So they're also about beefy as the What Were Once Men. Both of these creatures are there to kind of take some hits, which is why you can keep the number of them relatively low, rather than swarming them. Like they're not full mooks. These are actual, enemies that you have to deal with. The cave roper has attack lash, which is just a normal weapon attack, meaning they deal d6 +4. It's a near reach, and when their barbed tongue whips and flays. They have a grapple. A single near target can resist with a hard strength roll or be dragged in and held as food. And this is again similar to the drown ability, where I would not roll against the player's defense. I would just roll directly against the. I would just have the player roll directly a hard strength roll, and in case of this room, it's a 12, so it'd be a 15. This would be a save, and so if a player were to, I keep bouncing back and forth, but if a player were to come out and say they were bouncing around and they're using some hopping abilities to kind of move here, all of a sudden this cave roper grapples out. This player has to make a hard strength roll or get grappled and start getting dragged towards this cave roper. And then with no roll that I get to chew, the cave roper chews on its held prey as an action. Victim can use a hard cons roll to reduce the weapon damage to half with sheer will. So it's kind of a sequence. The lash is just a basic attack. Grapple, they pull them in. There's no damage dealt, so that's why it's okay to just have the player just roll the save. But on the next turn, if they can't break free, and it doesn't say specifically how to break free, but I would still keep it as a hard strength roll on the player's turn. They can't move. Their action could be either to try to break free or maybe attack, depending. Is up to you. But then the true is the cave roper just deals damage, and the victim rolls his hard con and reduces weapon damage to half. So that's a d6 plus 4 halved if they successfully deal hard con, and that is not against the player's defense. That is just straight damage. Other things for the cave ropers is that they are hard dwellers. There's usually, between 6 and 20, again, depending on your party, how you want to have many of them. That's stalagmites and stalactites, because if you want to escalate this challenge a little bit more, you can see them on the floor as stalagmites. But if you want to escalate things a little bit, as your players are maybe just wrecking things and you want a little bit more disruption in your scene, have some stalactites, the ones up on the ceiling, reach down and then grapple with a character below, and if they fail, they get pulled up to the ceiling, and now the players have to deal in some way with like range attacks up to the monster, to the cave roper, or when they break free, they fall down into the water and whatever. So you can have some escalation as you pull with the stalagmite cave ropers down below and the stalactites up above, and you can separate the parties out that way. The cave ropers are immovable. They're fused to the rock. They can't be moved or move without being destroyed. They're only found in natural caves. They're camouflaged, which makes it hard, a hard roll. So a 15 in this case to see at originally. They're greedy. They don't coordinate. They fight over. So this is a fun moment where you potentially have 2 cave ropers like tugging these guys back and forth. They're not taking any damage, but now it's like, it's still a hard strength roll to get free, but now it's like you can't even attack or whatever. It's just try to break free as best as possible, as you all work through that together. But this is kind of how, so that's the details of the scene, basically using the core method. But how does this scene kind of really play out, and what other things would I potentially suggest including as we go through this? So again, we start back here. Our players are working through this. We've got a timer going for the invincibles. Well, as they decide how to approach things, they can either, swim across, which is fine. They can explore down here for their loot. Maybe they might get something goody. They might try to jump across using the platforms. They may be able to try to skirt around and do a couple dex checks to like scurry along these ledges. They could also, find their way up here and do the same thing on this side, climb along the walls there. Like, however they want to go through it is totally fine. There's no apparent way across the lake, but that doesn't mean it's impassable. The players just have to address this problem and find a solution in their way. I would, having these ledges or climbing or whatever, you can include those things. If they do try to swim across, this is where or whenever they do get close to the water, this is where you start pulling in the what were once men as the stalkers. You start tugging them off the wall. You start pulling them off of stalagmites as they jump from stone to stone, or pull them down if they're swimming. Like, you first pull in the what were once men there, so that you start contending with them. But then as players get pulled into the water, or as they move straight across, this is where you pull in the cave ropers. I wouldn't necessarily have the cave ropers address anything on the edges if they do decide to go that way, maybe these close ones. But because they're camouflaged and they're not entirely sure, what I would end up doing is, if they're unaware of everything, they would jump up to one of the stones, for example, or as they approach one. I would just roll a d6, and in a 4, 5, or 6, I would have it be an actual natural stone. On a 1, 2, or 3, it becomes a cave roper. If you want to keep things absolutely hidden and random, or you can set in stone, if you have the map already built out like I do here, you can set specific ones, and if they decide to go towards these particular things, I would usually have them spread out, so it's like here, you know, in these kind of formations, so that there's a kind of a clear line straight through the middle. But then this cave roper can reach out and grab him here. This cave roper can grab him here. This cave roper can grab them here. So that's how I like to do it if I use this particular map, is have them spread out so they're kind of addressing the center line. And maybe this one can focus here. If he's up here, this one might get distracted over here. This one gives this one a free shot across, or they're distracted with this one over here. But you're also dealing with the what were once men. And so this can be a little tricky as you go about the whole thing, but that's really how I would do it. And then you have the invincibles coming in down the way, and if the players are dilly-dallying, what I end up having happen is that if there's any players still over on this far side, you can, you know, have them up and the invincibles attack, or if they're slowly running through, I just have the invincibles literally just start walking. They'll just like walk into the water, and then they'll just walk out of the water at the far side in another D4 rounds. The last thing that you can do is in the core one, it does say noxious vapors. This is another option for escalation if you need it. What I would end up doing is, if the invincibles are kind of under the water, or things are moving along fairly quickly, then I would have a D4 timer, and then maybe after a couple rounds, I would have like a bubble of noxious fumes burst out from either the waterfall or the water below. And this noxious fumes would be it would probably escalate the target number, probably to a 13 or at most a 15. And if I would probably just do it every round that you're still in here, it's just going to increase the target by 1. So first round, it's 12 to 13, 13 to 14, 14 to 15, and that's where I would stop. Just again, a motivation way to kind of like spur them forward. But at the same time, I would probably have it like, once the noxious fumes come in, I would have maybe the what were once men dive below, because they're noxious and they don't want them. So you can reduce the what were once men threat. The cave ropers don't care. They're made of stone. They don't, whatever, they'll still stick around. But then you kind of move things through with the noxious vapors as you kind of change the scene and disrupt it. And that's pretty much the core version. It's, again, you can see that this is getting a little bit more complex as you're setting up this dynamic of multiple types of enemies attacking. These enemies are here to pull party members away from each other, both by drowning or by grappling. You have to find your way across. You've got some dex challenges. You want to stay out of the water. Whatever, you got a little bit of treats. You got the invincibles coming. A lot more is at play, and you want to build into that tension of like, we gotta go overall, and give some really good opportunities for both skill challenges as well as combat, because you could kill the cave ropers, you could kill the once men, some really good hits, but this is where we have to start getting a little bit more tactical with what we want to do. And that's the core version. So let's talk through the Doomvault, the expanded Mega Dungeon version, as we pull everybody back to the beginning and we look through what is available there. The one thing that you'll notice is, as we read through this, says this, you'll notice that the Doomvault Mega Dungeon changes the name from Mirror Lake to the Lake of the Dead. And let's pull this back here. And I'll have, again, I keep pointing over here, but whatever. Changes it to the Lake of the Dead. And it says, this immense cavern has been formed by water action. The ceiling is a maze of huge stalactites and aging rope bridge that are there anchored. The floor of the space is a huge black lake. The opaque water stirs now and then with ominous ripples, but then the cave is otherwise eerily silent. No light source is present here. So very dark. So you could increase the target if you wanted, but I'd still leave it as a 12. This is a huge area that has many playable features. There are 4 access points: the rope bridge, spiral stairs. Even if Doomvault is destroyed in your storyline, this cavern will remain. Even with expedited movement, magical speed, or sheer luck, this huge space should take characters 4 to 8 rounds to traverse at minimum. So either if you're doing the core version or the mega dungeon version, like, keep that in mind that this room is much larger, so your near, far, close movements should be taking some time to get through this, depending on your session time length or whatever. Try to balance it out, but this is a longer, larger room, similar to the long pattern. The timers that we've got set up here is that every d6 rounds, a chunk of stone falls from the ceiling, hitting a random spot for 3d12 damage and causing a massive noise. Any heroes near the edge of the lake will be grabbed by those who once were men after 2 rounds, and then d4 rounds after. So right away we've got our timers built in. The first thing is we've got some stones that will fall through, and that's just going to be in d6 rounds. So for example, I'll just say that we ended up with a 3. So in 3 rounds, stones will fall down from the ceiling, dealing 3d12. How you decide on what that space, if you were using this particular room, I would roll like a d10 and then use the specific like grid squares as where they fall down. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 10. Or you can roll like a d12 and then have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Or you just use like the clock method. So you just roll a d12 and follow the chain of the clock, the numbers on the clock, and just kind of the general direction. Be a little bit more loosey-goosey there if you need, depending on if you're using a grid or not. And that's 3d12 damage, so it's huge. It's a huge hit, but it's really random if players are going to get hit or not. The other thing is you have the What Were Once Men, who after 2 rounds, so you've technically got these guys for 2 rounds, and this is something that I would potentially either I would have showing or just keep track in your GM journal. After 2 rounds, once men will be attacked the closest person who's near this lake, and then after that initial 2 rounds that you may or may not have like revealed to your party, then you put out a d4 round, and you put them up there and say, hey, these once men's, they'll come back every d4 rounds, and they know that they're kind of on this cycle, and so you can work into that between the rocks and the What Were Once Men were there. The threats for the room is the lakes here teeming with those who were once men. They hunger for prey and treasure, always looking in black water. There's no limit to their number, appearing in groups of d6. To heighten the challenge, a giant tentacle may emerge, or a creature cultivated by its lesser hosts. So, one, we don't have any cave ropers to deal with in this room. If we're using the mega dungeon, we've got more of the What Were Once Men, and this is where you can potentially look at like the Master Edition version. It's the same thing, except they just have Lash and Drown. They remove the magical spikes, and so you don't have as big of a threat from ranged. And so if you're careful, you may be able to stick, kite around these guys as they move around. But they're spawning, and so every time there's no limit appearing in groups of d6. So what I would end up doing is after that initial attack, I'd roll that d4, and I would say they're not going to necessarily attack every 4 rounds. They're going to spawn every d4 rounds. And so you roll a d6 every time the timer goes off, and more are coming. And so it gives more precedence to move forward. And again, another great way, just like the noxious fumes were there to escalate the scene. If things are going along, you can escalate it with a giant tentacle, and this tentacle is just kind of reaching around and smashing and grabbing players, and you just have a kind of a beefier creature in the scene to deal with. Now the treats is, rather than potentially the skeletons, I would still consider having the skeletons there. You could drop in a treasure chest, and this is one that I would make obvious to the players, that in the darkened water you can see the glint of this treasure chest down below. And so if they were to swim down with a hard con roll, swim straight down, they can retrieve 1 random loot, assuming they are not killed in the process. So they're dealing with the What Were Once Men or whatever. This is where I would drop in like an epic piece of loot or a magic piece of loot, something really, really good. And you can even tell players that that's what it is. This is going to be something in the What Were Once Men are always looking for treasure, and there all of the legendary, all those heroes that have come past before, they're going to store their best stuff down below where they can have it. And so you can say, if you do go for this treasure chest, like, I'm not just going to make you roll shabby, like this will be epic or magic, and you could get something good, but at great risk. And so risk and reward, I really like including some kind of those treats where you can be explicit and say, this is going to be good, don't worry. And it can alleviate a lot of some of the hard feelings with random loot sometimes, where you're like, I don't really want to go for a loot because I might get some moldy buns, or I might get something super awesome like a crystal prism or whatever. So being honest with your players on that this is epic or magic can really entice them to interact with the game in a different way. So something to keep in mind. But again, as well, I would still have the Invincibles rolling that D4 and included. So you've got the What Were Once Men, potentially a giant tentacle if you need to escalate, and the Invincibles to have the backward pressure to move them along into the scene. So it really kind of ends up, what I end up seeing a lot with these games, or in this particular scene, is most players don't try to swim across. They know that it's risky business to kind of cross the water. In this particular map, I wouldn't make a big deal of dex checks to cross this water, because the last thing you kind of want is to kind of discourage them from a potential solution at a risk. So for me, if you are going to have some stones that they can move across, only make them roll for a dex check if they're trying to do something extra with their move, but I would limit it to just crossing the water there. Because you're already dealing with What Were Once Men, giant tentacles, ropers. There's no reason why you also have to make them deal with dex rolls. And then that's the same thing if they were to move across the sides. I wouldn't make them roll for dex or strength or whatever. Just reduce their movement down a little bit. Have them be a little bit more exposed. If they try to do extra things, like, I'm going to hang on to this wall, and then I'm going to like pull out my sword and be swatting at these things, like, sure, you can include some hard rolls or make them roll certain things to do that, because it becomes in question, but try to reduce the kind of like the silly rolls of roll for dex to see if you jump across. If you fail, you fall into the water. There will be plenty of reason they might get pulled into the water with the What Were Once Men and cave ropers. Like, don't have them fall into the water just with a basic roll. Things are gonna be tough enough. So something to keep in mind. But yeah, otherwise, most of the time I just see players skirt the sides, and a lot of the times I see them just book it, which is fine. But this scene in particular is a really fun room design to try to play around with those knobs and those levers of separating the party, pulling them across, giving them diverting targets, or splitting their attention between saving their friends, getting across, potential loot, dealing with monsters. Like, there's too much for them to just tank and spank through this, so they have to work through all of that and be reactive while they try to move across. That's where I think the fun of this scene really comes into play. If I were to kind of build out this scene using some index cards, I would still just kind of have all my stuff here in the center, and then what I'd end up doing is just having a simple kind of like edge on either side that represents the banks on the room here, and you can kind of make them bigger or smaller depending on your need there. And then what I'd end up doing is just having a series of cards as platforms, and everything that's not explicitly kind of stated is water, and then you might be able to skirt around the side there, so you could have some cave options there or whatever. But then you would just use the platforms as the positioning for where things are moving. So depending on how detailed you want to make the scene, you include more cards. Like you can include a piece for the waterfall, you can include a piece for some ledges or whatever. And so this could give them some movement that they could move around. There, this is a ledge that they can jump over to or whatever, and then you just have the tokens for the monsters in between and go from there. So you can just kind of have this be as detailed as you want and just use the cards as platforms. So now it's just a platform jumper, and anything on the card itself is something that you can interact with directly unless you have a range, and then you can interact with cards external to you. But this doesn't have to be super complex. Just a series of cards works great for these particular things. So however you do decide to run the Mirror Lake or the Lake of the Dead, generally my advice is take a note of the different pieces, play with those levers, give them some room to breathe with your players, and present this as a problem that needs to be solved. It's really entering a more complex situation, and that can be a good change of pace between the Hag's Roost and the Long Pattern, which were much more simplistic problems that they need to solve. So now there's a lot more variables in this room, and then in the next room where you're going to see that the problems kind of de-escalate, and there's going to be fewer there's less complexity. So I really like having the Mirror Lake here in this part of the scene, because it does add that variety. It goes from low complexity, high complexity, low complexity, adds variety, more rooms to play with, more monsters to deal with. It's a really good thing. So don't forego that because you might be scared of the complexity or whatever. Like, take advantage of it, make it part of the game, and really lean into that overall. But what do you think? How have you run the Mirror Lake scene before? What stories have you faced? Have you fallen victim to the What Were Once Men? Have cave ropers cursed you and dragged you around? The giant tentacle or the invincibles caught up to you? Like, how has the scene gone down for you, or how might you do it yourself? Let me know in the comments below, and we'll look forward to the next room, which is, I believe, the Osric's Gate. We'll look forward to that, as well as you can check out the other previous Long Patterns or Hag's Roost video, and we'll look forward to the next deep dive. We're about halfway through. We got lots more to explore in the Doomvault.